Welcome to our, is it the Spiritual Life series here at the St. Charbel Center. I'm very pleased to be able to offer one of the first group. And my talk this day is on searching the depths of the unconscious, the Desert Fathers and Psychoanalysis. And this is only the second time I've given a talk on this subject, so you'll have to bear with me. I've decided not to use notes either, so bear with me as we go along. And it's the idea behind this has been 40 years in the making in terms of the study of the fathers, but also the study of psychoanalysis, and seeing how the two intersect in many ways in the revelation of what it is to be a human being, the mystery of being human, the struggles that we have, both on an emotional level and also on a spiritual level. The trauma that sin brings to our life, but also the trauma that we experience of living within a fallen world. And so how I want to present things here to you today is more of in a narrative style rather than in a typical lecture. And it's something of a self-history. So just bear with me. As I said, it was 40 years in the making. When I was a young postulant, I had been a member of the oratory for 35 years before going to the Eastern Rite. And so I was not even a novice at this point. And one of the priests of the community, Father Drew Morgan, who's a member of the diocese here of Pittsburgh now, gave me a Christmas gift of the first 3 volumes of the Philokalia. And Philokalia simply means love of the beautiful. And what it is a compilation of the writings of the fathers from the 4th to the 15th century that was put together by St. Nicodemus the Hagarite and St. Macarius of Corinth on Mount Athos. And it was right around the time that the monks of Mount Athos went through something like a Vatican II, if you will. There was a group of priests called the Culavades who were very intent on how the spiritual life was being lived, but also the liturgical life. And so they began to re-examine the great spiritual text, how things were done liturgically. Often saints' feast days would be celebrated on Sundays. And so there was this movement to have Sunday be simply dedicated to the celebration of the resurrection, things such as that. And I won't go into detail about it, but there was also a kind of spiritual renewal that took place, a going back to the sources, a ressourcement. And so the monks from the various monasteries began to go back through the readings of the great monks and the saints that they had available to them in their libraries to see if they were living the life that had emerged in regards to the spirituality of the church from very early on, from the early monastics in Egypt, in fact. The Eastern churches are often called monastic churches. And they're called monastic churches not because everyone who belongs to them is a monastic, but because the spirituality of the East arises out of the monasteries and out of the desert. Their understanding of the human person, their understanding of the struggles and the trials that we have with our own passions, how it is that we develop the discipline of prayer and to heed Paul's call to pray without ceasing. How do we pray with constancy? And so their spirituality really goes all the way back to the beginning of the desert movement, from the 4th century, sometimes 3rd century even, all the way through the life of the Eastern churches. And there's a surprising homogeneity about that spirituality that I think makes it very beautiful as well. Their understanding of anthropology, psychology, but also the dynamics of the spiritual life and dealing with demonic provocation, with one's own thoughts, with the weakness of will, the darkness of intellect. All of this surprisingly is the same over the course of centuries. While there's development and deepening of it, there is something that is surprisingly similar that they all began to see over the course of the centuries in that spiritual battle. And they become then the source of the spiritual life of the entire church, East and West. And so even as you develop Western monastic communities in the Latin Rite Church, they're still all built upon the wisdom of the Desert Fathers. And any unique charism that arises out of their founder, St. Philip Neri, St. Ignatius of Loyola, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, is still built upon this fundamental understanding of the human person, but also our struggle with the passions and growth in virtue. So I was given this gift. And at that time, only the first 3 volumes were published in English. So an enormous amount has happened over the last 30, 35 years in terms of making these rich writings accessible to us. 2 more volumes of the Philokalia, completing the edition, have been published now in English. The 5th volume, finally, after so many years, coming out just in the last 6 months. So we have at our fingertips the wealth of the wisdom of the spiritual tradition available to us. And when this priest, Father Drew, gave me these volumes, I devoured them. I had been a typical undergraduate college student at the University of Pittsburgh. And my own spiritual history, I was raised Presbyterian. There was deep faith there, but there was nothing in terms of the history of the church, its development, or a spiritual tradition. Certainly a love of Scripture was present there, a love of prayer, but I had never heard of the Desert Fathers. I had never heard of the Philokalia, and I had never heard of any of the Eastern Fathers as well. And even when I became Catholic as an undergraduate, I never heard of any of the Eastern churches. All I knew was the Latin Rite Church. So I didn't know that there were over 20 Eastern Rite churches in existence, and that from them, Christianity itself emerges, because Christianity is an Eastern phenomenon. It develops in the East, but also our spiritual tradition. It is an Eastern phenomenon. It begins in the East and moves west gradually. Many of you might be interested to know this little historical tidbit, that when Columbus came over in the ships, one of the first volumes that was translated into Spanish that was brought over was The Ladder of Divine Ascent by St. John Climacus. I've always found that to be extraordinary, that one of the greatest of spiritual writings came over with Columbus to the New World. And in that sense is a blessing, certainly, maybe the foreshadowing of a blessing of some renewal that can take place. With Vatican II, though, there was supposed to be this ressourcement that's similar to the one that took place on Athos, where we would go back to the sources of our spiritual tradition. And it never really took place. I think I could say that without any acerbic kind of feeling behind it. But it never took place. There was a lot of experimentation that took place, certainly with liturgy and then also with the spiritual life, but no deep immersion in the spiritual, liturgical, and ecclesiastical history of the church, not at least in the way that we need for a renewal to take place. There's a great Jesuit spiritual writer and theologian, Irénée Hauchier, is a Jesuit, said, whenever there is renewal within the life of the church, there you will find the Desert Fathers. And if you could remember one thing from this day, I would hope it would be that. Wherever there is renewal within the life of the church, there you'll find the Desert Fathers, because it's precisely there that they take us back to the gospel, to embrace it in an unvarnished fashion. What does it mean to be a son and daughter of God? What does it mean to have the Holy Spirit dwelling within us? How are we to enter into the spiritual battle that we see our Lord engage in the desert? What does it mean to fast, to pray without ceasing, to overcome the passions, to grow in the virtues? These are things that often are presented to us. I went through seminary, maybe had a class on the patristics, but none of this was offered to me. It was only well after seminary that I was exposed to it. And it's an interesting thing, because I think many people look at the Desert Fathers, or look at something like the Philokalia, or the writing of the Ladder of Divine Ascent by John Climacus, as being meant for monks or nuns. This is something for their spirituality, their life. Yet St. Nicodemus, who translates and compiles the Philokalia, says, the best and the beautiful belong to all. What is being put together here is not meant only for those in black robes and wearing big hats. That it's meant for all who are baptized into Christ. This is our path to embracing the grace that has come to us through him, that flows to us from the cross, in the gift of the Holy Spirit, and in the sacramental life. How do we allow that to bear fruit in such a way that we become Christ, that we manifest him in a concrete way within the life of the world? So often in the West, we have an overly intellectualized view of the faith. So it's notional, creedal. We believe certain things. And if there's a moral element of it, it is avoiding particular sins or going to confession regularly. But it often remains something in our mind, an abstract notion, and Christ too remains an abstraction for us. Whereas in reality, the mind must move to the heart. We must move from the notional to the real. What does it mean to live the gospel in an unvarnished fashion? We are formed, to be honest, more by the culture within the world than we are by the culture of the church or by the gospel itself. And so when I came in contact then with the Desert Fathers, it opened up a new view of not only the spiritual life, but what it means to be a human being. In the same way that becoming Catholic did for me in giving me a sacramental worldview, that the incarnation does not end when Christ ascends to heaven, that the presence of Christ remains through his body, the church. And we continue to experience the fruit of his reconciling us to the Father through the sacramental life. And so it's not an abstract reality, but ever so concrete. And so in a similar way that becoming Catholic opened up that worldview for me, so did coming into contact with the Desert Fathers open up a unique, distinctive, and unrepeatable vision and experience of the spiritual life. These men left everything when Christianity becomes accepted and embraced by the culture. And immediately they began to see things wane in terms of fervor, of zeal, compromise with the culture itself. And so they go into the desert. There are no monasteries, there's no particular role. And sometimes they go by themselves. The first hermit, Paul the Hermit, that St. Anthony didn't even know about, goes out to the desert simply because his brother-in-law wants to put him to death. His parents die. Paul comes into a great fortune. His brother-in-law wants to kill him. So Paul runs out into the desert and he stays there. In some sense, he's the truest of monks because he's driven not by this idealized or romanticized notion of what the desert was, because there's nothing romantic about it, believe me. But he's driven out there simply by the providence of God, perhaps that he wasn't aware of at the time. But he begins to experience over the course of time the fruit of that silence, that stillness, the deep poverty, and the prayer that emerged from that. And he grows in sanctity, only discovered when he's in his 90s by St. Anthony, who goes out into the desert searching, is there one like me out here who's living the same life? And he comes across St. Paul the Hermit a month or so before Paul dies. And so they talk about the spiritual life. His only request of Anthony is that he go to St. Athanasius and receive the cloak from him in which he would be buried. So Anthony goes off, gets the cloak, comes back, finds that Paul has died, but he does what Paul asked. He buries him in Athanasius' cloak. And the story is that the lions that Paul had befriended, if you will, dig the grave for him, for Anthony then to bury him. So, an opening up of a worldview. For the Desert Fathers, the spiritual reading was the gospel and the Old Testament. And again, they were immersed in it in an unvarnished way. They had stripped themselves of the things that often become distractions for us. They moved away from other people, from the distraction of the culture, material goods. And they had to rely solely upon the grace of God to provide for them, to protect them. So to trust in his providence. And out of this, eventually, more and more individuals begin to go to the desert. And Anthony certainly becomes one of the most famous of them. And eventually, what starts as hermits living in the desert by themselves become communities, cenobitic communities that live the common life, and then eventually a role of life begins to develop for them. They live a common life, but yet pursuing all the things that lead to this interior transformation. In the West, and in modern times in particular, we have this kind of false bifurcation, if you will, between the active and contemplative life. There are those who are contemplatives, those who live the cloistered life in monasteries, nuns and monks, and those who live an active life, whether religious or lay people living in the world. For the monks, there was no distinction. The active life was the interior life, the struggle to overcome the passions, our attachment to sin, to develop an attachment to the Lord, a love of prayer. All of these things allow us and give us the capacity to live in the way that Christ desires. It's not by our own strength and not mere acts of charity. We're not called to perfect our natural virtues as Christian men and women. What we are called to is far greater, deification, to become one by grace with the most holy Trinity. And it's out of that reality that we are enabled to love with a godly love, to give ourselves to one another as Christ has given himself to us, to allow ourselves to be broken and poured out in love with others, for others, without counting the cost and without condition, to love unconditionally, to show mercy and compassion unconditionally. This is what the Desert Fathers went out into the desert to learn and to understand. And that they struggled. They began to see that what goes on interiorly isn't necessarily changed by changing your exterior environment. So going off to the desert did not magically change their hearts or their interior life. The Desert Father stories are replete with images of anger, of resentment, bursting forth from their heart at inanimate objects, a monk tripping over a log, cursing it, becoming angry with it because it got in his way. So they began to see that the passions were far more deeply rooted in us as human beings by our attachment to sin. And what the passions are habitual sins, those that have become a regular part of our life that we've embraced over and over again. And so we almost lose our freedom of will. They become the natural response to us in seeking the pleasures of the world, or to satisfy our own needs and desires. And so they saw that moving into the desert might have freed them from some of the things that are distractions for us. The constant chatter and noise of the world, idle chatter, gossip, things such as that. The constant distraction that we invent for ourselves through entertainment, movies, Netflix, the internet as a whole. Many of you might know a more modern spiritual writer, Henry Nouwen. Have you ever heard of him before? Great writer, lived in the 1980s and 90s and passed away not too many years ago. But extraordinary writer, but he defined entertainment as meaning in between. It places you in an in-between state. So a state of virtual reality. So say if you're watching a movie, it's not reality, it's about somebody else's life. You're absorbed in it, but it has nothing to do with how you're living your life and what's going on within your heart. Nor are you focused upon He who is reality, God, or on the reality of what's going on within your heart. So we've become experts at inventing newer ways of distracting ourselves from the one thing needful, Christ, and His presence within our hearts, and removing the impediments that exist within our hearts to loving Him fully and giving our lives to Him. And so over the years, I began to immerse myself in the study of the Fathers and gradually began to offer groups on them. And this was no easy thing for a Western Rite priest, a Latin Roman Catholic priest, because all these were Eastern writers that originated in the East. So on one hand, I had Orthodox saying, why are you reading our men? Or are you reading our saints? Or those in the West saying, again, why are you so focused on the East? We're Latin Rite Catholics. And so your interest in the East and the Eastern Fathers or Eastern liturgy, their spirituality, is odd. We don't get it, we don't understand it. So it was a difficult path, but all along, the very superiors that I had, spiritual directors, seminary professors, said, stay there and immerse yourself in it. And so that's what I did. And in seminary, I wrote a little journal. We had to keep a journal on one spiritual father. Every week we would do readings, and then we'd have to turn that into the professor. And at the end of the year, he gave it back to us. And I did St. John Climacus, the Ladder of Divine Ascent. And at the end of it, he said, hold on to this. Someday you may use it for groups. So I filed that away in my mind. And after ordination, though, I did exactly that. I used the little synopsis that I would write about these as a way of entering into them. And so, let's see, I've been ordained 30 years. So it wasn't long after that that I began with St. John Cassian. I figured I'd choose a Western monk. Cassian is a Western monk who went to the East to live with the Egyptian Desert Fathers in order to learn their wisdom and the way that they lived out the interior life. But I was hobbled because I was also a campus minister, and I had to work on 15-week cycles to try to present the Fathers to them. So I had to edit out, and typically I was editing out all the great stories in order to get through the basic teachings of the Fathers. And so I did these kinds of groups. Climacus, I did Western Fathers, John of the Cross as well, the Cloud of Unknowing, but I gravitated towards the Eastern Fathers. And about 17, 18 years after being in campus ministry, I started to do ministry with adults, and then I was free. I was no longer bound by the semester system, and I could do what I always wanted to do, which was read the Fathers verbatim, word for word, in a group over the course of years until it was completed. Right now we're reading the Evergetinos, which is 4 volumes, 400 pages each. We're about a volume and a half in, and it's been, 3.5, 4 years. So we're on like an 8-year schedule. But it's wonderful, because when you read it over and over again yourself, you read it out loud, and everybody hears it and then talks about it in a group, then it becomes alive. They want to understand, well, how does this apply to me, or my particular struggle living within the world? And then something else happened, COVID. And nobody would have thought COVID would be a blessing. I always shied away from recording groups and certainly did not want to do Zoom. But COVID made it a necessity. It was either that or have no groups whatsoever. But then all of a sudden, the groups took off. And it became not just a Pittsburgh study group, but a kind of worldwide study. We have somebody from every continent now who participates in the group. And we went from 50,000 downloads of the podcast to 500,000 within a few years, which to me, having to do with the Desert Fathers, seems extraordinary. I know half of those belong to my mom, probably listening to them over and over again, but it's something extraordinary. It's showing that there is a thirst there, a hunger for what the Desert Fathers give, which is praxis. How do I live the gospel in a concrete way? How do I practice the gospel in a concrete way in the world? How do I overcome the things that afflict me on a day-to-day basis? I know my weakness, my poverty, the things that I am attached to, that I have a solid grip on, and even when I break away from them for a short period of time, I backslide, and I'm right back there again. We also live in a time, as you know, where pornography is just overtaken the world, and most of the studies say that young boys in particular have their first experience of internet pornography at age 8. So I began to see, as a priest, people coming to me who've been addicted to pornography for decades, even old men in their 70s and 80s, and women too. It's not just men. And it's become something that's very, it's not a static image like old pornography used to be, but it's very, it's a video, it's very visible, it roots itself within the imagination and in the memory. And once that takes place, it has a deep grip on a person. And so most of the people that I had coming to me for spiritual direction or confession hated it. It was like it was the plague that they had fought to overcome for years. It destroyed their self-identity as a Christian, but even as a human being. But yet, over and over again, they were drawn to it. So, I began to see that the fathers had so much to offer us. Psychologically astute. They knew the workings of the mind and the heart so well, how subtly we can rationalize our embrace of sin, or our resentment towards our brother, or our neglect, our slothfulness in prayer. They knew it through and through because they had no distractions in the desert. That's what makes them so valuable. They could see right through themselves, and God could see through them. There was no hiding it and no escaping. And that's what makes them this permanent treasure for the life of the church and a permanent source of renewal within the life of the church too. They reveal something to us about what it is to be a human being, but also one who's been redeemed and shares in the grace of God. So I enter into the life of the priesthood, and I began teaching in these groups, but I also start meeting with people for spiritual direction and pastoral counseling. And as a young priest, it's hard because people will come, and often they come to you last as a priest when they've exhausted every other possibility, and they'll come and they'll say, "Father, my life is a mess. I've destroyed relationships. I'm rooted in all this sin. Help me, fix me." And young priests fall into that trap, in that pitfall over and over again. Fix me. Tell me what I need to do in order to overcome what holds me in bondage. And yet, it's not that easy. And it's not programmatic. Each person is a mystery. And even the way that they struggle with sin is unique to them as a human person. And so there's not one sort of model that we can sort of say, do this. And for example, if somebody comes to you and is struggling not only with a particular sin, but a psychological trauma, and they're anorexic, you're not going to counsel them to fast. Certainly there's something that's become tied with eating and what eating means for them, or not eating, or throwing up what they've eaten, that is acting as a defense mechanism that is holding them together. But to immerse them more deeply in that would only be to cause greater harm. But over the course of time, I began to have people coming to me that experienced more and more trauma. And some of this trauma was even pre-verbal. So even before they were speaking as children, they experienced physical, psychological, emotional, sexual abuse or neglect, but pre-verbal. So this is during periods where it's not as though they could think about this or even how to deal with it. And Freud, in his first writing, thought that a lot of the trauma emerges in people's life because of sexual abuse. And he found out very quickly that wasn't true in his clinical work. that trauma can emerge not even from what we would look at and see as explicitly abusive. We have to go back and think about how would a 3-year-old experience the absence of a sick mother who for 6 months was in the hospital and so absent to them, or the complete absence of a father figure. How would a child adapt to that reality over time or understand it as they grow and go through the various stages of development? And what do those do who had been sexually abused in terms of how it affects the way that they look at sexuality as a whole, intimacy with others, but also trust and intimacy with God, feeling that they have been betrayed or abandoned at some point in their life. And so how does a priest engage in that reality? I think most priests would say, not any fault being theirs, is that I cannot help you. I think you need to seek out psychological help. And that's reasonable, to refer somebody to someone who has a background in the field that can help a person who's undergone trauma that even affects their spiritual life. But often that can be the end of that relationship. Once you send a person to somebody else, it can feel like you're also abandoning them, or that they are too much for you and too much even for God. And so that is often the last time that you would see them. And so people were coming with borderline personality, often self-harm, parasuicidal actions, cutting, became more and more frequent. But even times psychosis, where it was clear that a person's perception of reality had become so distorted that it became very difficult even to have a conversation with them. And so as a priest, again, as one who's called to love and whose eye is often drawn to one who's suffering, it is a difficult thing to feel that you can do nothing and so walk away, or feel that you need to refer. So at that time, I think to myself, well, I need to further my education in some sense. Not only if I'm going to help people who have experienced trauma, but if I'm also going to offer appropriate spiritual counsel. How do I help people in their spiritual life engage in prayer, develop a trust in God, if I have no understanding of the trauma that they have experienced in their life? And my first inclination was to go study counseling, in particular Christian counseling. And I don't want to come off as flippant here or rejecting, but I found these programs typically to be completely inadequate. And one of the reasons for it is that it's typically an amalgam of thin veneer of evangelical spirituality and an eclectic approach to psychology, and most often focus on something like cognitive behavioral therapy, which I think has done people much good over the course of time, has brought much healing, allowed people to work, engage in relationships when they suffer from depression, anxiety, things such as that. So I understand that. But there was this attempt, I think, and often is this attempt, to morph the true traditions and to do so in an inadequate way. And what you get is this watered down vision of things that ends up helping no one. And so I couldn't bear it. And after studying 36 credits, I almost made it there, I quit the program. And I got some wonderful counsel at that point from my spiritual director, a Benedictine who also happens to be a trained psychoanalyst, who went through the whole training. And so I had the fruit of that throughout my entire spiritual life, of someone who listened and developed this capacity to listen on a very deep level, and also then be able to offer this spiritual counsel that was rich, who also is a very holy man. So in that way, I'm blessed and have been blessed both with his friendship, but with others he's guided me towards. So he suggested that I go through this 1-year program at the Pittsburgh Psychoanalytic Center. It is in psychodynamic psychotherapy, that is depth psychology. And I went through this 1-year program, and it was interesting. It was myself, priests and clerics, with all of these MDs who were psychiatrists or PhD psychologists who were going on to gain further training in their psychotherapeutic work. And it was fascinating. I knew I was right where I needed to be for a number of reasons. But before I get to that, I'll say I did the 1 year. And so I talked to my community. I said, I've found this already to be an extraordinary aid. Personally, for my understanding of myself, my life in community, my life as a priest, but also in the people that I work with. And I'd like to go on for further study. And so I was going to do it academically. And there was a program, a master's program in psychoanalytic studies in London. And there was also an oratory there, the London Oratory, that has these magnificent liturgies. So I thought, yes, that's where I'll go to do my graduate work. And I got in, shockingly, to the program, and was about to go, and then I was foiled. My community elected me provost of the community, and I was superior, and so it put the kibosh on that. But what I found out is that providentially it opened up these greater doors. That, as I mentioned, Pittsburgh has its own psychoanalytic center. And so at the Council of Spiritual Director, why don't you go through the whole training program itself? And so I did, and it was very rigorous, had to be interviewed. If you've ever been interviewed by a psychoanalyst, and you have to write your own psychological biography as you're interviewed by them, and it's an interesting experience, to say the least, and because they do see a lot. It's a very sharp instrument. So I go through the whole thing. I have to present case studies. I got in. And again, this opened the door not only to the academic work, so studying all the works of Freud, his clinical work, but all those who followed. It's typically a 7 to 10 year process. But what is interesting about this is that for generations, the church said that one of the works that priests are not allowed to engage in is psychoanalysis. Not allowed to do that work, not allowed to engage in it. It was canon law. And it only changed in more recent times. And I think part of this was because Freud and many of the early fathers of the early analysts were, a little Freudian slip there, many of the early analysts were atheists as well, or they followed this medical model, weren't spiritually inclined. And so, there was this mutual animosity between the psychoanalytic community and the church towards the psychoanalytic community. So they didn't like us, we didn't like them, but it was interesting. Freud could not hold on to friends. The sort of whole Oedipal complex thing ruined every plan. Like every one of his followers then wanted to individuate and take their own path, develop the theories they were seeing in their clinical study. And so inevitably their friendships with him dissolved, except one. And it was with a Lutheran pastor named Oscar Pfister, who was a pastor, educator, and he went through the whole training, and he and Freud remained friends all of their life. And when Freud wrote his work against religion, The Future of an Illusion, he saw it as a psychological construct, a defense, an auxiliary construction. Pfister wrote a book, The Illusion of a Future, in response to The Future of Illusion. So they were able to engage in this dialogue, but Pfister was free. He wasn't, his identity was rooted in something deeper that prevented the breakdown of that relationship. But otherwise, it's a difficult place to enter into until more modern times. So I go through the process. And the first place that I begin to see a kind of commonality, and one of the reasons that I wanted to study it was that it was depth psychology. It wasn't looking at simply what was going on the surface, the symptoms that people were manifesting, depression, anxiety, or even things like cutting, but rather looking what was behind the defense mechanisms, what gave rise to the trauma. And in our culture, you've probably noticed that we've gravitated towards psychotherapy that is short-term. So often what insurance companies will pay for is like 10 weeks or 10 sessions that's covered, and then you're on your own, or you have to pick up the cost on your own. And I'm sorry, when you're dealing with the mystery of the human person, 10 sessions isn't going to do it. And psychoanalysis, like the spiritual tradition, understood the mystery of the human person, that each person is unique. Each person manifests the struggle that they go through in a unique way as well. And so you have to enter into that reality to understand what the person is experiencing. And so what I saw in psychoanalysis, I saw among the Desert Fathers. In those early communities, often called skeets, there would be like 4 or 5 monks, and there would be an elder among them. And every day, the young monks would come back to their elder and tell him all the thoughts that they had throughout the course of the day, the movement of their mind and their heart, in order that he might be able to understand what was going on with them, but also to help apply a healing balm on a spiritual level, to give them counsel in some fashion. And I saw the same thing in psychoanalysis. It's talk therapy, and it's not this back and forth. It's rather the individual on the couch revealing everything that comes to mind, thoughts, emotions, feelings, things that happened during the previous day, dreams even. And it's an interesting phenomenon because you lay on the couch, just like you see in pictures of Freud. You lie on the couch with the analyst behind you, and you know nothing about the analyst or their personal history, anything about them. They're there for one thing, for you, and to listen to the internal narrative that develops and manifests itself over the course of the time while you're on the couch. So in my training, and this is the other interesting thing about psychoanalysis, is that anyone who's going to practice it has to undergo it themselves. Likewise, if you're going to be a spiritual director, you need to be in spiritual direction for decades before you engage another person in their spiritual struggles. And so 7.5 years I was on the couch. And at first I thought, what in the world am I going to talk about? And it's surprising what comes forward. And it is revelatory. Sometimes it's just one little part of that internal narrative that gives light. This is how my mind works, or this is how I've experienced certain things in my life. And then things begin to come together and coalesce over the course of years. Sometimes I said it's embarrassing. My analyst was a woman. And I was on the couch one day and I had this image of her. Has anybody heard of the Reese's monkeys? The trial where they feed these baby monkeys, but what they do is they put this metal monkey mother in a cage, and they just put some like cloth over her. And the monkeys are frightened, these frightened little things that cling to this metal cold monkey, but they have a bottle there to feed the monkeys, so they cling to her only because of the little bit of nourishment that she's giving them. And that's how I experienced my analyst. And it came to mind. And so I said, because they don't give feedback, they listen. A lot of times all you hear is once in a while they're writing or they drop their pen on the floor and have to pick it up. And so I said, this is a little embarrassing, but my experiences of you is like that mother among the Reese's monkeys, like a cold, heartless, offering no warmth, no comfort, because that's what it felt like. You're left alone with your thoughts. The analyst is not to interject. They're not advice givers. They're not to interject their own opinion about what's going on because they don't know. They don't know what happened to you over the last 30, 40 years of your life until it begins to emerge and you tell them. and again in an unvarnished way. They are to be like a blank screen on which you are projecting then all the thoughts and the feelings that you have. And it becomes this extraordinary thing because I can't blame her for being cold and unforgiving and having that thought or feeling. It's arising out of myself. And this is exactly what the Desert Fathers saw in the desert. These things arising from very deep within that would draw them to sin or make them very angry or give rise to certain dreams or make them focused on satisfying their bodily appetites in opposition to what would be good or holy. So it was a striking thing that I began to see, and that there had to be then a willingness, it taught me, to suspend judgment. That means as a priest even, when you're listening to another person, you cannot be picking up on something that they said as defining and saying, aha, this is your problem, you need to do that. I've heard so many priests walk up to people and say, you should be a nun, or you should be a priest. And I'm thinking, where are they getting that from, other than a satisfying of their own ego to be able to tell somebody something, that they want to hear or that sounds wonderful, when they have no clue about who that person is, other than that they express some sort of external piety. Are they fit for the priesthood? Would they persevere? They don't have a clue. And so if you find somebody like that, run away from them, because all they're going to do is damage. So suspending judgment and listening to the person's story, entering into their hell, which is exactly what Christ did with each and every one of us. Again, we often think of the cross or the descent into hell with abstract notions. It's an idea, and maybe even an idea that we embrace or appreciate, but often we have no understanding of that Christ entered into the depths of every single person's hell, knows their sin, their trauma, everything, everyone past, present, future. He entered into it and took it upon himself. I've heard so many people tell me over time, what does Christ know about becoming old? He was crucified at 33 and it was only for a few hours. What does he know about what an old person experiences? Or somebody who's experienced some traumatic loss or was physically or sexually abused. It's hard for people to wrap their mind around not the idea, but the reality that he enters into that in order to bring healing and hope, that's not what shapes their identity. That their trauma or their sin is not something that shapes their identity. And look how people balk against that in the gospel. When they dragged that woman caught in adultery out into the town square, there was a morbid delight there. They wanted to stone her to death. They wanted to know the pleasure of being in this position of moral superiority and acting on it, because it gave a sick sense of power. And that still is active and present within us whenever we judge anyone in any kind of way, and we hold on to that resentment, because we do not know what is within the heart. St. Isaac the Syrian said, there is no justice, there's only mercy. In a sense, we have to wipe it out of our own minds and hearts, because our sense of justice always comes up against a line in the sand, a certain condition that will say, that's it, I'm taking no more, I'm done with you, you're out of my life. And it can breed then hatred, resentment of the deepest sort that prevents forgiveness, that poisons the soul. And so a priest has to be willing or able to enter into that. I'm not saying that every priest has to become a therapist, but a priest has to be able to understand the affliction of those that are coming to him, and has to be willing to enter into it and not run away, and not to fix it, and not even to give counsel, but to be the presence of love. I've had people put me to the test over time to see if that is exactly what would happen. Swear at me, say, I'd like to break every single window in your office. If I could, I would pick up this lamp, I would stab you with it. And I think part of the reason for that is because what is experienced internally is so deeply painful, and the self-hatred, the self-contempt is often so painful that there is no words for it. The only way that they could express it is either through self-harm, cutting themselves, or by directing this anger outwards towards another. And to be able to have someone who can remain within that and see that dynamic, and to stay with them over the course of time, including when they have a hatred for God. We live in an age where there's this gender dysmorphia that people experience, often that's rooted in sexual trauma as well, where they hate even the idea that there are genders and wish God had never created them or never created gender at all, that they wouldn't have to deal with the pain that causes them because there was something in their early life, or even again pre-verbal, that created this deep confusion, pain, or trauma associated with it. So I began to see all these things that allowed me then not only to make this connection with the Desert Fathers, who, by the way, are far more astute than any psychoanalyst that I've come across. Having said all that about psychoanalysis, that their understanding of the workings of the human heart and the subtleties there are extraordinary. It's just that we do not read them with depth. And plus, if we're not living it, internalizing it, you're never going to taste the healing or the sweetness that they speak about. So the reading of things verbatim and seeking to internalize every single page transforms the way that you look at yourself, others, and God. So I go through this training over the course of the years, and it has an enormous effect upon my work within the confessional, spiritual direction, pastoral counseling, across the spectrum. And hard, very hard. In fact, after many years of it, I developed fibromyalgia. One night in an appointment, I was sitting in the chair listening to a person and felt uncomfortable. I couldn't, get comfortable in the chair. And I thought, oh, it's probably because I saw like 8 people during that day and just like a kink in the back. And that night I woke up in excruciating pain all over the body. And then for 2 years of my life, going from doctor to doctor, they could not figure out what it was. Because fibromyalgia is typically, it's women who typically are diagnosed with it. And I didn't fit perfectly the diagnostic criteria. And finally, it was 3 doctors who came together who diagnosed me. So I lost 2 years of my life. I remember looking out of the window on the 4th floor of the building, seeing all the students file out after the 9 p.m. Mass. And I had this thought come into my mind: you will never say Mass publicly again. That's how bad it got. Until I had to make this, they diagnosed it, started treating it. All I could do in the beginning was set the tables for dinner. That's it. And it was this slow move back for another year or two so you learn a lot, and sometimes you don't learn a lot through analysis. Perfectionism, this sense of altruism that can drive you to the point of ignoring what's going on within your own mind and your heart and what's going on physically. And I learned a hard lesson through it. But so, the thing that slowed me down a little bit, a lot. But all through this was the presence of the Desert Fathers. And as I went deeper and deeper into them, began to see, again, now having gone through analysis, now having studied the psychoanalytic writers for 10 or 12 years at that point, this continuing immersion in the Desert Fathers, being able to see, okay, they understood better than what we imagine. They weren't these individuals that hated the body, hated the world, and hated the self, and that just went into the desert to punish themselves. They went there for a particular reason, one reason, seeking Christ, and to let go of everything that became an impediment to that reality internally. And because of this, because again, it wasn't just an abstract notion for them, theory, but based on clinical experience, lived reality of pursuing Christ and the struggle with sin and the struggle to grow in virtue, that a kind of freedom began to emerge there for them. And how they speak of the life of faith and the sweetness of prayer, the intimacy with God, the healing that takes place, will make you weep. There's a beauty to it. It's poetic. They're poets before they're ascetics. The way they express it is extraordinary, because Ephraim the Syrian is a great example about this. He and Isaac the Syrian, I think, are two of the best of the Desert Fathers, because, especially Ephraim, because he captures it in poetry that stretches the mind and the heart in particular to grasp something of the beauty of that relationship with God, that we have a God that has entered into that trauma and has taken it upon himself. There's not one thing in our life that we struggle with in isolation. Christ is there. And so this is where the psychoanalytic process begins to shift for me back to the spiritual. The insights are still there. Suspension of judgment, the revelation of one's thoughts, and understanding the mystery of the human person. But what psychoanalysis does is it reveals often that trauma, that internal narrative that causes so much pain, so much affliction, and it does bring a kind of healing on an emotional level. But for the Christian, we enter into that not simply entering into ourselves. It's not navel-gazing or looking at our own thoughts or our emotions, but it's seeing those things in the full light of Christ. And that light of Christ is what brings immeasurable healing, because it frees us from one thing that modern psychotherapy cannot, which is identifying ourselves with the wounds. That for those who have been sexually abused, those who hate themselves because of their struggle with depression or hate life, often their identity becomes rooted in what they've been diagnosed with. There's a purpose of diagnosis, and it can be helpful. Has anybody heard of the DSM-4? It's what psychiatrists use and psychologists use to help diagnose. If a person fits these criteria, if they're manifesting these various aspects in their life, that they likely are suffering from this, it helps them then develop a therapy plan, but also what they might need to use in terms of pharmacology. But whenever it's given in a kind of wild way, a person is told you're bipolar or you're borderline, then that's how they begin to see themselves. I am this. And it perpetuates this experience of the self, and actually it can become a boundary to a person experiencing the fullness of healing that we all desire as human beings. There's nothing that's going to fill that void within us. There's nothing that's going to heal that wound within us, because the deepest wound that lies within us is the absence of God. God has created us for himself. And we are only satisfied, we're only nourished, we're only healed when we enter into that relationship with him. The word desire, desideratum, means a sense of lack, a sense of incompleteness. And so it's only in turning to he who made himself the bread of life. He alone is the one who can satisfy the deepest longing, the deepest hunger of the human heart. But it is also he alone who is truth, he alone who is reality, that can heal the deepest part of ourselves that our talking about can't, because he can go where no therapists and where we ourselves cannot go. That in the spiritual life, even the imagination, the memory can be healed. That seems almost unfathomable. And if you've talked to somebody that has experienced trauma, it's there on the surface. And even Freud said it. about the unconscious. He said, it's always immediately available to us. Anything that triggers us, we never forget anything, no matter how far back it was, and no matter how elusive it is, or how much we've done with it. If something triggers it, it comes immediately back to the surface, because in the unconscious, there is no sense of time. And in Christianity, it's only he who is beyond time, he who has created it itself, who can enter into it and bring a kind of healing that endures unto eternity. What we are offered through our Christianity is not just strength to make it through the day, or to endure, or to be able to succeed in this world, or to get through failures. In fact, Christianity pretty much promises just the opposite of that. You're going to be hated all because of me, for speaking my name. Those who seek to kill you will think that they are serving God. We're told, do not resist one who is evil. It sounds like insanity when you slow yourself down and listen to it fully. But when you understand that Christ is in it, and in it fully, you begin to imagine that there is hope for healing. And those who are able to do the therapeutic work while engaging in that spiritual life can experience extraordinary things happen to them. A great story among the Desert Fathers is Moses the Ethiopian, or Moses the Black. He was a rapist, he was a murderer. In the Evercatinos, we read this story about him wanting to steal the flock of somebody whose farm was on the other side of the Nile. So he's a huge man. He sticks a knife in his mouth, swims across the Nile. He's going to kill this guy and take his flock. And luckily, the guy is not present there. He does not commit the murder. But he encounters the monks, and he undergoes this extraordinary conversion. And he becomes actually one of the greatest of all of them. And he gets word that the monks are going to be attacked, and they're going to be martyred. And so he sends them away, and he stays at the monastery, and he gives his life. He eventually becomes a martyr. But it's sort of interesting. The story of him often tells of his former gang attempts to rob him. And so he roughs them all up, and he carries 4 of them on his shoulders back to the monks, and he drops them all before the monks and say, what do you want me to do with these guys? And they end up converting to the faith as well. And so the deepest wounds, the deepest evil, sin, is not beyond the reach of God's grace. Mary of Egypt, another extraordinary example. So many speak to us of what is possible by the grace of God. That God's grace reaches the unreachable, and he's willing to love the unlovable and to remain with the person who hates themselves and not shy away from that. And that small bit of light, of presence, that is sometimes offered, it doesn't have to be analysis, offered by a priest or a man or woman of faith, is enough to allow a person to persevere through that darkness until they come out the other side. It's not fixing people, it's bringing them the light of Christ and to Christ. So it's ironic that most Christians gravitate to Jungian psychotherapy or cognitive behavioral psychotherapy because of Freud's reputation for atheism. But it turns out that depth psychology, psychoanalysis, we hold the most in common with he who was our greatest enemy. And Freud didn't see everything, but he did see a lot. And he did see a lot about religion and religiosity, too. One of his theories is that faith is like an auxiliary construction. It's something the mind creates in order to make us feel safe in a dangerous world. And so we have an all-powerful Father who will come to protect us. And that is often how it's treated, psychologically as a defense for people. Rather than a genuine faith, it's something that we would not give away. It's like an old shoe, an old pair of jeans. It might be 30 years old, but we're not going to throw that out because it's so comfortable and such a part of who we are. And so our faith life can be that as well. It can be an auxiliary construction. It provides us with a defense, just enough to get through life. But is it life? And is it what Christ offers us? And the answer to that question is no. And so to have someone like Freud, who perhaps could call us on the carpet when he sees so often that it is an illusion that we've embraced rather than reality, is pretty important. And we cannot, if we believe truth is a person, we cannot be afraid of any truth, even if it's pointing the finger at us and saying, hypocrite. You're not living what you profess to live. So, enough rambling. Are there any questions or comments that anyone would have? There's a lot to throw at you. 40 or 45 years of personal history. Yes. Is it Father Summerson? Is that right? No, I'm sorry. You look so much like him. Okay. I'm sorry, what's...
My name is Adam Marquardt. I'm a seminarian at UC.
Okay, all right. Don't tell him I...
He already knows we look like each other. The Metropolitan
You're his doppelganger.
Archbishop agrees with you. So you had your psychoanalytic training after being commissioned by your, at that time, spiritual father. And I'm aware of some other priests who have done this. What has the church said about priests doing this? And has it been encouraging now in recent years? Or what has been the church's stance on priests pursuing training professionally in counseling, psychology, this sort of thing?
Yeah, I think the church has come to the realization that we have to enter into the dialogue, the discussion, and we have the most to bring to the table. And we've done it in every other field. All the sciences, every area that you can think of, there are these commissions from the Vatican dedicated simply to the study of that subject so that we can engage in discussion with the world around us. And so we should be at that table and involved in that discussion. It's just that because of who the founder of the modern psychology was and his take on things, that this animosity began. There was a similar person. There was a Father White who was a Dominican who was friends with Carl Jung, and they wrote at the same time and engaged each other about psychology. But there's not much. And I think a lot of these schools have sort of come together with this attempt at Christian counseling. I don't think you can do it. You have to be immersed in both. We can't be lazy about the work. We have to be immersed fully in our faith life, living it, the spiritual tradition. But if you're going to study, you have to be fully immersed in it as well. And that's, I had the good fortune, perhaps I didn't realize what I was getting myself into. There were days that I dragged myself back from analysis and think, oh my gosh, I have to go through the rest of the day with my mind swirling. Because something would come to mind, a little fragment of that internal narrative or a dream that I had, and then set myself to appointments or saying Mass. And so it was a hard thing. And I made the decision not to pursue licensure in any way. Simply to have this, let me engage as a priest more fully. Because to put out a shingle, or to get licensure, but in particular to act as an analyst, you have to become that blank wall. And I don't think when people look at me, if they walk into my office, they're going to know I'm a priest. And it's not something that I'm willing to sacrifice. It comes into play every single day, every moment in confessional, every spiritual direction that I have with people, and even in terms of my own personal life. So it's been profoundly impactful, but I wouldn't practice it for that reason. And there's a time there too. I mean, if you're working with certain individuals 4 or 5 times a week for an hour or 45 minutes, it limits then the number of people you're able to engage. And while I would want to make it financially affordable, which is a problem for most people, that it would limit me in terms of my priestly work. And I wouldn't want that to happen. Yeah. Yes?
Well, I have a brother and a sister-in-law who went to school for Divine Mercy University, got their doctorate there towards Catholic counseling, and a brother who's considering doing a similar program from Franciscan. Do you know, do those programs incorporate the works of the Desert Fathers? And if they don't, like, how can I best, like, pass this on to them and encourage them to make that part of their education?
I think they do in some measure, as well as the study of philosophy, and which is tightly rooted to psychology as well, that they have it as part of the program. But what I found even in any psychological program to begin with is that lack of what analysts do, which make you undergo psychoanalysis as part of your training. I don't find that anywhere. And that, to be honest with you, was the most fruitful part of the experience. I had when I was a little boy, I was playing out on the porch, 2 years old, and my mom was making lunch, and the phone rang. And she turned for 15 seconds to answer the phone. In that amount of time, I grabbed hold of a railing, pulled myself over, like Superman, down on my head 12 feet onto a concrete driveway, and fractured my skull, and was comatose and was in the hospital. And it's interesting, I went in an analysis, I asked my mom about it, and this is some 40 years after the event, longer. And because there's no pictures from the time, of course, and that we rarely ever talked about it. And so I asked my mom, how long was I in the hospital? Because my sister would tell me certain things, maybe a month or so, or 2 months. And my mom said, no, maybe a couple days. And then she said, wait a second. She said, I can't remember. This is over 40 years later. And because of the trauma of that, she could not remember the details about it. And one of the reasons I bring that up is that came up in my analysis over and over again, including, I think, my decision to become a priest, all of it. Because most psychologists, psychiatrists have depressed mothers that they then, in their psychological work, seek to be able to do what they could not do as a child. And that doesn't take away any value about their work. It just sort of explains it. It makes sense that you would enter into a field that you would be empathetic to those who struggle. You would have a special desire to help lift somebody out of that. And I know she had to struggle with that. It was a devastating experience. But for me, it changed the whole entire family dynamic. It changed the whole way I experienced the world, because all of a sudden the world was a dangerous place. Even though I was only 2 years, again, this is sort of just the beginning of verbal, picking up verbal things. I couldn't understand probably any of that went on, other than what it did to me and how then others related to me. I think I became the favored child. Don't tell my sister that. But she was 5.5 years older. So all the attention gets focused on you, but then very protective. I remember going to school, and I'd be crying, I'd be puking those first days, kindergarten or first grade. I just had this social anxiety that lasted for way too long. And my dad had to stand at the front door with a belt to make me go. But I have memories of seeing my mom in the background, of, looking upset for me. But so the whole experience of the world seemed like a threatening place. I was a big kid. Nobody was going to mess with me in school, but that was what I was, probably afraid of, that I'd get hurt. And so, again, the most important part of the work is the same thing for the spiritual life. It's our living it and entering into it. St. John Climacus, at the end of his step on prayer, the very last paragraph, he says, everything that I've written here, you cannot learn from books. You only learn from Christ himself and by engaging in prayer. And I think that's at least the analysts picked up on that. You only learn by entering into your own hell or wounds in order that you might be able to enter into somebody else's. And the gospel teaches that. I mean, it's Christ stretched out on the cross, hanging naked, crucified. Father, forgive them for they know not what they've done. He shows us the path forward, that we are to withhold nothing back, or to be not fearful of anything within the world, to do anything for the others. Yes?
I have a question here. The decline in the spirituality in our society, the Western society, has that caused, I listen to different speeches, okay, and not necessarily Catholic, has caused a correlation with an increase in anxiety, different problems,
Yeah.
psychologically, okay? But they also brought up an interesting fact that we have so much leisure time, whereas for people in the Eastern, some other countries where they have to work 60 hours a week, they don't have a time to have some of these issues because they have no time to think upon themselves. And the replacement of myself as a god of our society versus the ego, do you find that a correlation?
Well, you could have fooled me, because everybody that comes to me says, I don't have enough time to pray because I'm so busy. It's just, yeah. Right, that's right. But yeah, I think our disconnect from the spiritual tradition has hobbled us. Again, because if our faith becomes something intellectual, it's not going to appeal to the deepest part of the religiosity of the other, to the heart of the other. Cardinal Newman's motto is cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaking to heart. And how can a heart speak to another heart if Christ, and bear witness to Christ, unless Christ is there? And there has been sort of this separation from the spiritual tradition as a whole. We like fast food, and we want our spiritual counsel from books to tell us, again, how to fix ourselves, how to reach contemplative prayer, or the stage of the dark night of the soul of John of the Cross in 10 weeks. And I've had numerous people come to me saying, I'm experiencing the dark night of the soul, when in reality, it's really the upheaval of their life that is at the heart of that darkness, typically. And I think what is needed is this ressourcement. And again, that we can't be lazy about it, and we take hold of what Irénée Hacher said, the renewal of the church begins always with the Desert Fathers. It always has. Philip Neri, one of the great saints of the Counter-Reformation, saw himself as a Desert Father living in the city. His two favorite works were the Conferences of Cassian and the Ladder of Divine Ascent, and he carried on his person the Conferences of John Cassian. Spent his first 10 years as a layman in Rome in the catacombs, praying all night long. And so this is where, it wasn't because of their personality. When we think charism, we think they're dynamic. Philip Neri is a saint of joy, of holy joy. But where do we think that came from? Was it his natural personality? Was he a jokester, practical jokester? Or was it the joy, the invincible joy of the kingdom that no one could take from him, but also that he could translate to others in order to comfort them? And I think it's the latter, that it is because of what was going on internally for them. And I think the problem exists in the West, because you remember I mentioned that in the East there's this kind of homogeneous development of the spiritual tradition. What you read among the 4th century writers, you even find among the modern elders writing in the East now in monasteries. But in the West, you find these spiritual traditions arising out of moments of crisis that aid the church, that strengthen the church. So the Counter-Reformation, you have Philip Neri, Camillus de Lellis, Ignatius of Loyola, Teresa of Avila, anyone I'm leaving out who's so important here. But they all present their age with the spiritual life and the zeal for the Lord. Ignatius in particular, this spiritual exercises. But the problem is after that charismatic figure dies, what perpetuates the strength of that spiritual tradition? And if that spiritual tradition was rooted in the Desert Fathers, rooted in the fullness of the spiritual tradition, and that is lost, then what do people fall back on? They're hungry. People are starving for spirituality. That's why they go to self-help groups. That's why therapists are so overcome they can't take more appointments. And it's because there is this exceptional void. It's once said that a starving man has no sense of hunger. A starving man has no sense of taste. He will eat anything that's placed before him, whether or not it's truly nourishing or not. And so people are going to have that experience of this internal hunger for God who created them. And if there is a void of spiritual elders, spiritual fathers, or if parents have not been formed in the faith to pass it on, that void is going to remain. And I'll stop here. The one hope we have is that we have access now where we can sit at the feet of these fathers as never before. I mentioned to you the Philokalia, there's the final volume being published in English. The Evergetinos, it's only been in the last 20 years that's been available to us in English. It's the greatest spiritual writing that I've ever come across. They're monks. In order to produce an English translation of it, had to go out and find all these different translations that did not mesh. And so what they had to do is they had to have their men study Syriac in order to be able to translate the ascetical homilies of Isaac the Syrian. We live in an age where we have that and we can be nourished at it. There is a monk, Paisius the Athonite, who said he read Isaac the Syrian's ascetical homilies every day for 25 years of his life. That's all he read, a paragraph a day. And one modern elder said, there's only 5 books you need: Scripture, the Philokalia, the Ladder of Divine Ascent, the Evergetinos. I'm leaving one out there. I'd add the Conferences of Cassian there. We don't need another book written. We don't need another program that's rehashed from the 1970s or 80s. We need this resource mont and to sit at the feet of those who lived it. Okay. We should stop now. I think we're well over time. Okay. Thank you so much. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. God bless everybody. Have a wonderful day.